Hey, we should be well ahead of where we're supposed to be, according to the syllabus. Which is good, because we'll get bogged down, I think, a little bit later. I'm having to use the doc cam because this thing's just not loading on this piece of crap computer. So, we talked the other day a little bit about the Rosetta Stone. So, you've got examples in the notes, and it looks a lot clearer in your version of a hieroglyphic transliteration where you have the sign, you have the hieratic, you have a transliteration, okay, of the signs to essentially graphemes to represent sounds, and then you have the code when it becomes more or less in the Roman alphabet. Let me lights. Let's kill these lights a little bit. Okay, try more. So everything we've talked about up to this point has been, proto-writing, pictograph, ideograph, analytic script. Now we're getting to the basics of real writing. Why is it real writing? It represents sound. Okay? So when we talk about what's considered to be by scholars real writing, it is some kind of graphemic, if you want, representation of sound. Not that necessarily this equals the sound. It's just one of those conventions, okay? It's one of those conventions, but it's a convention that has occurred over thousands of years, that we take this to represent s as a sound. There's nothing s-ness about this squiggly symbol. Somebody a long time ago could have just as well said that equals that sound, okay? So, syllabaries. First true phonetic writing systems. And Semitic is the first real one, okay? And the thing to know about Semitic is, for example, ancient Hebrew. You want to read the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and you want to read it in Hebrew. What's one of the first things you have to realize? No vowels. No vowels are represented. So, when you come across the word, if you saw which one was it? Third one? Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade or whatever. Okay? Indiana Jones had a little puzzle he had to solve, and he almost solved it fatally until he remembered. The word for Yahweh, or God, is just this. Okay? Notice. No vowels there. Okay? Or Jehovah, if you want. And, the thing in the movie was Jehovah, no vowel. And then he suddenly realized, but in the old alphabet, there is no J, because J doesn't come into the alphabet till about 17th century. Okay? So if you're reading Chaucer, you won't see the letter J. Where there would be a J in our language, in our English, there's an I. Okay? So the syllabic nature is that you have the consonant and an implied vowel. Now, notice, what does that mean? What vowel could you have here? Let's not assume that this represents the word Yahweh. It could be a bunch of different vowels, right? I mean, you could throw any vowel in there. So, context then becomes important. Is there a word that has I, O, U? So, Yehow. I don't know if there is in Hebrew, but more than likely, I'd say there's probably not. Or a name, that has that. Okay? So it's the syllabic nature and implied vowel. We still do this kind of thing today. That is, we have we have consonants that have kind of implied vowels. For example, how do you say this letter? Not sound, letter. M, What's it begin with? Eh. M. N. Okay? But the sound is what? M. N. We don't call it a M, though. We call it an M. Okay? So there's an implied vowel before that when we're referring to the letter, not to the actual sound. So, ProtoSinaitic script. Notice that final clause. ProtoSinaitic script may be the earliest recorded syllabary, if that's what this script actually over here on this piece of rock actually is. That is the source I got this from, and it's not necessarily Wikipedia. That's where the images are from. Got a book. It's either in my office or my home. It's not just the history of writing. It's something else. It's a British Museum text, and that's where I got the thing about the ProtoSinaitic. We're not positive that this is, but pretty sure. Pretty sure meaning I hate to use this phrase because it has been so misused over the last 20 years. The quote-unquote scholarly consensus is that ProtoSinaitic is a syllabary, okay? So if it is, it's the earliest written one. There's nothing that predates this. And if I remember right, I should have that in these notes, but I don't. I think this is dated to something like 1500, 2000 BC. Okay? It's called ProtoSinaitic because it was found in either copper mines or salt mines in the Sinai Desert. Okay? Scoot up a little bit. So we're going to go from there to the Greek alphabet. Now that's a big jump. Yeah. Go to the Greek alphabet. Why? Because the alphabet we use is directly traced back to the ancient Greek. Okay? But the Greeks didn't just come up with this on their own. I know the Greeks came up with an awful lot on their own, which is why we talk about Greco-Roman and Western civilization. But they essentially stole what became their alphabet. Okay? They got it from the Phoenicians. Okay? North Semitic syllabary, see the chart. We've got a chart on the next page that I simply Xeroxed from the handbook that I used to require for this class. But because the textbook is so expensive, and the handbook is almost as bad. It's about $100 for a paperback book. I just can't condone charging that much. Okay? It shows you the development from ancient Phoenician through Greek, through Latin, some Etruscan, all the way up to what we have. Okay? So, where were the Phoenicians? Anybody know? Northwest coast. Well, kind of hard to. Yeah, that works. Northwest coast of the Mediterranean. Okay? So, modern day southern Lebanon, northern Israel. The two major port cities of Tyre and Sidon that are mentioned, for example, in the New Testament, those were Phoenician cities. There was also a Phoenician city on the North African coast, Carthage. Carthage was a Phoenician colony, okay? Wiped out in, what, the 4th century BC during the Carthaginian or the Punic Wars against Rome and such. Okay? Phoenicians are mentioned prominently. If you're familiar with, if any of you are taking, I think he's teaching it this semester, Dr. Neff's what's that class called? I just taught it last year. It's not ancient Greek and Roman. It's classics of the Western world or something like that. But it's Homer, Sophocles, Plato, Aristotle, etc. I'm sure he's probably teaching either the Iliad or the Odyssey. Phoenicia is mentioned in the Odyssey. It's one of the places that Odysseus goes to during his 10-year voyage back home. So you got some examples of the Phoenician alphabet and their sound values. Okay? So you see the symbols, and then the sound values come down below. 7.4. So what do the Greeks do? They take that system and they adapt it. Why? Because Phoenician has some sounds that they don't need. So it has some symbols they don't need. And Greek has some sounds that Phoenician doesn't have. So what do? They take some of the symbols that Phoenician has for sounds that the Greeks don't have, and they merely say, okay, we're going to, not like they have a committee meeting that does this happens over time, and they adapt those symbols to represent the sounds that they need. So, vowels and consonants become distinguished. Again, Phoenician being a syllabary, vowels aren't necessarily included. Okay? They change the arrangement of letters. And again, the notes, they're based upon your book, and it's abbreviations, essentially. So, change the arrangement of letters. There's more content about that in the book. To add new symbols. Phi. In Greek, in ancient Greek, this isn't just it's what? It's more philosophy with a breathing sound. That becomes, over time, in English, so it's synonymous with, or it sounds just like in fish. Okay? Chi. Every time you see that H after a letter, it means it's aspirated. It's breathed. Whale. We don't do that, however, in whale anymore. Gam becomes gamma, and then psi. Okay? So you have the Greek alphabet. Well, you've only got part of it there. I didn't mean to break that up into 2 pages. So you've got part of the Greek alphabet there. Oh, take that back. You do have all of it there. I didn't see the second column. So go on to the Romans. Why? Because pretty much everything that the Romans have, they stole from the Greeks. Stole and then improved upon, added upon. Roman law is an expansion of Greek law. Roman arches are an expansion of kind of Greek architecture and such. And I'm sorry, that is not more legible up there. So, how do the Romans get it? They get it through Etruscans. Who are the Etruscans? They were the people who lived in the Italian, what's today called the Italian Peninsula, before the Romans came. When did the Romans come? What's the historical date that's usually given? It's the 700s when Romulus and Remus were supposed to have come and founded Rome, being suckled by the wolf and such. We'll see an image later on. I think I included the image of that mythological setting. But mid-8th century, okay? So the Etruscans were there before then. We know very little about the Etruscans. Why? They didn't leave much writing behind. There have been some tablets discovered, and you can see the kind of the relationship of Greek to modern Roman in the Etruscan. You can see how the Etruscans took what they found, modified it a little bit, and then that gets modified even more later on by the Romans. So they take, they borrow, they adapt. What do? They add more letters. Why? Because of sounds in Roman that weren't in Greek, or sounds in Roman that the Greek letters didn't work for, so they adapt, modify, and add letters. So notice, distinctive letters. That is, they draw distinctions between k and g. Okay? I and J, and then lowercase I and J, but, big but here. That's to represent sounds. I, j. When we'll see, a little bit later on, that symbol for ja pretty much drops out for close to 1,000 years. And you have I representing both. Okay? In the 17th century, for example, John Donne often signed his name ID, or initialized his name ID instead of JD. Okay? So distinctive letters for C and G, I and J, Q, R, U, V, W. Notice what is a W, literally?
Two V's.
It's two U's.
Oh, two U's.
Okay? But how do you represent a U when you're inscribing that in stone? It's a lot harder to carve a curve, an arc, than it is a nice good angle. Okay? So U and V are often interchangeable. Right? Though, in later writing, you'll see V used at the beginning of words, U used in the middle of words. Even though we think V and oo, totally different sounds, yes they were, but in Latin sometimes, where we think a word should begin with a wa, it began with a v. Or where we think a word should begin with a v, it began with a wa. For example, my marker, Latin for man, pronounced, according to Latin professors, weir. It's not veer. Okay, it's weir. W-I-R. How do we know? What's the Old English word for man? All of you know this because you've seen films about this man who gets transformed into a wolf. Werewolf. Weir. Okay? So, what you have in this chart, and this is the thing that I Xeroxed from a problems in the history of the English language, you have the development that is Proto-Canaanite, about 1500 BC. You have the Semitic name and then the sound, how it looked in Phoenician, early Greek, then the Greek name and the sound. That is, the Greeks, the Phoenicians, gave a name to this letter form. So, Aleph, what do the Greeks do? What happens to the E and the F? It's called metathesis. They get reversed. Chaucer, in his Parliament of Fowls, poem written 1375, 1380, talks about the Thrida Brida, third bird. The RI metathesizes over a period of about 100 years. So that now we say third. Yet we still have the word thrice. The THR, that's the older, more historically, if you want, or etymologically accurate form. Just like the word burn. Historically, it comes from the verb brennen. The R comes before the vowel. But for some reason, and we don't know why, they flip. Okay? So, can you kind of see how that's slightly oxish like an ox's head? I mean, it's like this, essentially. And those are the horns. We could go back and look at the cuneiform, and the cuneiform is very clear, like that. Well, kind of Phoenician. Okay? So, alpha has the sound ah. This is what it looks like in Etruscan. That's what it looks like in Classical Roman. Until 100 to, I think that's 700 AD. That's the form it took in its what today we call capital letter form in manuscript. We'll talk about what capital and lowercase mean in a few moments. Okay? Carolingian minuscule. Carolingian, the name comes from Charlemagne. Okay. Charles is Carol. Right? Italic cursive, about 1400. Notice, this is like our letter A. Okay? And then modern printed and script. So there's the development of A, there's the development of B. So now notice, alpha, let's go to the Greek. Alpha, beta, gamma, delta, on down the line. And you've got, in this chart, essentially all of them. So let's move down to see where we get some distinguishing going on. Okay? The wow, it's called wow or digamma. Look at the Etruscan, this is right here. Okay? Classical Roman does what? Just flips it around. Right? And it becomes what in English? Doesn't sound anything like wow. Though, in most scholars say that's actually pronounced vav. Okay? You know, here it's W. So you have F, etc. Development, differentiation of I and J. Notice, nothing, 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 and then you get down to unseal, and somebody decides at some point in time to distinguish between the two forms. Right? We're not going to spend a whole lot more time on that. So let's look at some later developments. For example, when we go back don't know if you saw this. I wrote this for you guys. English major minor meeting, the 24th, 3 o'clock, JUB 100. Meet other majors. Talk about stuff English majors can do. A bunch of other stuff that I forgot. There's signs posted all over the building. You can't miss them unless you're blind. Literally, you can't miss them unless you can't see them. Okay? So, go back to, for example, cuneiform. How is cuneiform written? I mentioned it the other day. Read, wet clay. Okay? It's not written in the sense that we think of, where you're dragging an implement over a media, okay, or medium, but you're doing what? You're imprinting. You're pushing the end of the reed in, okay? And that is creating impressions. It's creating angular impressions, okay? That's how you form the letters. Brush, that's pretty clear. If you have a brush, you're dipping it in some kind of paint or pigment, and you're, drawing it across whatever the medium is. Read, we talked about that. Chisel, probably about the hardest form of writing there is. Okay? Especially if you're thinking of any kind of letter that, again, has a curve to it. It's really hard to make curves in stone and wood. Okay? We'll talk about stone and wood in a moment. Stylus, very similar to a reed. For example, the Romans used styluses, or styli, if you want. Why? What did they write on? Well, they used styluses in pens. They wrote on wax tablets. Some of these wax tablets still survive today, with the text written on them from 200 AD. All right? So, the stylus, you have a wax tablet. Think of an iPad, for example. But instead of a screen, you've got a border of wood and a substrate of wood. And in that is hardened wax. Right? You can drag a stylus across the wax. And then what do you want to do? What do you do when you want to reuse it? You heat it. Smooth it out. It's like Etch-a-Sketch. for first century Romans. Okay? Write what you want, shake, it all goes away, and you reuse it. Or as they're now coming out with, again, notebooks. Electronic notebooks, essentially. Not notebook like a laptop, but notebook like a 3-ring binder kind of notebook that has a kind of quote-unquote paper on it, and you write with a stylus, and then when you're done, you can just lift the page and go back, and it disappears. And it's electronic so that when you write it, you can then send it to your computer, and you have all your handwritten notes right there. Okay? But it's essentially a modern Etch-a-Sketch, but a lot easier to write than it was with an Etch-a-Sketch. Pen. Where does the word pen come from? I keep misplacing my marker. Penna. Feather. Why? Because you take a goose quill, or goose feather, or an eagle feather, or maybe around Tennessee, a vulture feather. You cut the end off, make a nib out of, dip it in ink, and you're on your way. Right? Or you can also use a pen to write in wax. Right? Medieval scripts. Majuscules, minuscules. That's when we get the first differentiation between sizes of letters. And if we were to go back to that previous slide, essentially, say this one, between the large letters, the uncial, and then the smaller minuscule, okay? This would be called, even though this is uncial, it's not Carolingian, this would be called majuscule, great, large, minuscule, small, tiny, okay? But we don't refer to, let's go back over here, we don't refer to this as a majuscule E, do we? Or as a minuscule E. What do we call them? Uppercase and lowercase, or capital and lowercase. So where do we get uppercase and lowercase from? I should have saved this picture. Kick myself for not doing it. A couple of weeks ago on Facebook Marketplace, one of these quote-unquote cases was for sale. It was a printer's case. Okay? And after printing developed in the 15th century, you had people making type, that is, individual letter forms out of metal, so that when you would have a book printed, you went to a compositor, publisher, let's say, and the publisher would give the text to the typesetter, or what in the early days at least was called a compositor. Think of this lectern as holding a big case, and the case had down here, like on this keyboard, had a box, and the box had a whole bunch of little tiny compartments. Then up here, like attached by hinges if you want, is another case, a whole bunch more compartments to it, okay? And in the compartments down here, you have letter forms, individual letters. So, and I don't know exactly how they would be set up, but you'd have one little box that would have all letter A in it. And the one next to it would have all letter B. And the one next to it, C, D, E, all the way throughout. And then you'd have a box of just periods. That is a piece of metal that would ultimately stick up and would just have a dot. And then there'd be another one, another box that would have semicolons, colons, commas, etc. Exclamation marks, quotation marks, apostrophes, etc. What's the difference between an apostrophe and a comma? Shape-wise. Keep doing that. Apostrophes usually have that, right? They've got a little thing up at the top. Commas don't. Okay? So, the letter forms that were kept up here were what were called majuscules or capitals or uppercase. That's why we call it uppercase P uppercase, because it was pulled out of the uppercase and put in. A lowercase p was pulled out of down here. The phrase, mind your P's and Q's, why? What's the difference of them, between them? Q is a P backwards. But what else is different? What do I not include here? Q has a little serif tail on it. But what often happened was that when the printer would run the would run the platen over the bed of type to ink it, sometimes the letter forms didn't get entirely inked. And that was often one of the parts that didn't get inked. Okay? So, mind your P's and Q's means make sure you put your P's in the way they ought to be, because you don't want this. Because that's not a letter in the modern English alphabet. Okay? We'll either get out of here early or we'll start Indo-European. We'll probably start Indo-European. So what else? Okay, let's look at some other alphabets. Now this doesn't have much to do with the history of English language. It's just kind of interesting. So Cyrillic, root Cyrillic, for example, the alphabet for almost all the Slavic languages. Where does the name Cyrillic come from? A guy named Cyril, who, along with his brother Methodius, brought Eastern, that is kind of what today you would call Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox, Eastern Christianity to the Slavic nations, South Slavic, Bulgaria, Romania, those countries. Okay? And St. Cyril developed an alphabet for the Slavic languages. Okay? So when you those of you who remember the good old days of the Cold War and the Olympics, all the Russian gymnasts, athletes, etc., had this on it. CCCP, okay? The Soviet Socialist something Republic is what that stood for. Okay? Leave that aside, because this is more interesting. The Old English Futhorc runes. Most scholars of runes think that ultimately the runic alphabet, and Old English is one runic alphabet, another one is the Germanic, it's a little bit different but not much, that they ultimately derive probably, like the Roman alphabet, from Etruscan. That Etruscan is kind of the common parent, and so you have the Roman alphabet and all of its modern derivatives, but it also gives rise to the runic alphabets. Okay? And if you're into Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, this is the basis ultimately behind Tolkien's dwarf runes and others and such. Okay? So here's an example of Germanic runes. I think these are Germanic and not the Old English. This is my photograph. Sorry, it came out really dark on you. This is what's called the Franks casket. It's in the British Museum. This is made of whalebone. Okay, it's about that long, about 8 inches long, I'd say, maybe 9 inches long, about 4 or 5 inches wide on its sides, about 4 or 5 inches tall, and about 4 or 5 inches deep. Okay? And it has a central image or two panels on the front and back, and then on the two sides, it's got another image. And all the way around these images is this big, long runic inscription. Okay? I think your book might include what the runic inscription is. But you can barely see, doesn't show up well on this image, this panel here. Okay? Each of the runic, each of the images that is on this thing is kind of an image from a mythological story or historical story or event. Okay? The ones that are shown here, this is Germanic, pagan Germanic. This is Christian. So, for example, you can't see it real clearly. Maybe you can in your notes. You have a person over here sitting in what looks like a throne. And inside the person, right here, is what looks like another person. Any guesses? It's Mary with Christ inside her. Okay? Or what's being represented, not two titans, is Mary, the mother of Christ. And three individuals doing what? Offering her gifts. These are the three wise men. So this is the image or the story of the coming of the three kings. Notice they're each carrying something and they're offering this stuff to her. What looks like a throne is probably kind of an idealized form of the manger, the cave. Okay? So then that's this Christian image. What's this over here? This is the hamstringing of the god Wayland in Germanic mythology. He gets captured. He's a smith. He gets captured by this guy. This guy wants him to make him, I think that's the image. That's right. Yeah, he gets captured by this guy who wants him to make him some things in order to keep him from going away. This father of daughters, as it turns out, cuts his hamstrings with a knife. So he's crippled. So he can't move. So he's got to do this. And what he ends up doing is he ends up killing the guy's sons. I think he rapes his daughters. And the daughters are turned into birds. That's what the images are here. And they fly away. Nice image, right? Okay. One of the other images on one of the other sides is the sacking of Rome. Excuse me, sacking of Jerusalem in 70 AD. One is of Romulus and Remus, because there's a wolf, and they're nursing from her. There's five. Romulus and Remus, these two, sacking of Jerusalem. Can't remember the fifth one. I think it has something to do with Rome, other than Romulus and Remus. Okay. Anyways, okay. So leave all that aside. Come up to what's more important even for us. Printing. Okay? Johannes Gutenberg invents the printing press. 1453-54, sometime in that time frame. Does he invent movable type? No. Who invented movable type? Same people that invented gunpowder. The Chinese. Long before this. About 400 or 500 years before this. But movable type wasn't movable type as in a printing press. It was movable type as in like block type. Okay? But we also think there were people even long before the Chinese who invented something like this. There is a undeciphered script from ancient Greece. It's called the Phaistos disc. Look it up. And it's this round disc. If I remember right, it's like 2 or 3 feet in diameter. And it has essentially a sign in the middle. And it's got essentially like this. Okay? And these are divided up into segments. And in those segments are symbols imprinted. But it's not every symbol is different. Some of the symbols are repeated at times. That is, you'll see a symbol here And you'll see the same symbol here, and the same symbol here, the same, like it's a letter probably. Only problem is, we have no idea what this thing means. But it looks to be movable type. That is, it's not like somebody has gotten this wet disc or this big disc of stone, and they've taken a chisel, and it's like it was wet. I think it's big, large clay disc. And they had something, well, look at the bottom of this marker, and you got a hole with these little lines. It's like they have punches of some sort, and they punch the letter or sign in. So they've got several of these different forms, and they're going through and putting whatever this says into it. And it might just be nothing more than George Canelopoulos, made this pretty design. And that might be all it says, for all we know. Okay? So, Gutenberg's Bible, 1456. If you ever get the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C., go to the National Archives and see one of Gutenberg's Bibles. Okay? Right?
The Gutenberg Bible was among the earliest major books printed using...
Shut up. And it's there. Okay? Caxton, the first English printer, he sets up shop in London and prints first book printed in England. This is the very first book printed in England. The Dicton sayings of the philosophers. Dictas just means, like orations, wise proverb sayings and such. Okay? Earlier, he was in the Netherlands, Bruges, where he published the Receival of the Histories of Troy, 1474. Now, what happens as a result of printing? This is pretty important for us today. Well, yeah. It's important for most people. Some people still don't give a flying fig about it. Standardization of spelling. Prior to this, say during the Middle Ages, how did you spell? And a lot of people still do this today. How it sounds to them. That is, how something sounded to the speaker / writer. So we have multiple copies of poems or other texts from the Middle Ages that survive from differing dialect areas of England. And guess what? They're spelled differently. This practice, lasts up to today. But when I was a graduate student, when I was a doctoral student, and I was working for the general editor of the very own edition of the poetry of John Donne, one of my tasks was to pull up microfilms of manuscripts from the 16th, 17th century and scroll through those microfilms to see if I could find copies of poems by Donne that nobody had really seen before. And I found 2 copies that nobody had ever noticed before. But in doing so, in reading those literally hundreds of microfilms of manuscripts, I'd come across the spellings of various words, like flower, Flower, spelled Flower, Floewere, and then, another half dozen ways. Or shower, Showere, like rain showers, spelled shewers. Okay? And another half dozen ways. Why? Probably indicating a dialect area of where that individual was from. Punctuation. Developed by Aristophanes of Byzantium sometime around 260 BC. Why did he develop it? Because prior to him, there was no punctuation. And so when he develops punctuation, he's developing it for oratorical or rhetorical purposes, not, as in modern punctuation, for grammatical purposes. See, up until up until then. I'd say at the very earliest, up until 1800, there was no such thing as a comma splice. No such thing as, oh, well, this is grammatically incorrect because you're joining two independent clauses with a comma. Why? Because prior to then, the comma merely meant a pause. It's designed for oral delivery. Okay? System of points, Latin appositure, consisting of a high point or a full stop. And what's meant by points is, go back to your grade school or elementary school writing, and you had a worksheet that looked like that, right? So here's the base of the line, here's the top of the line, here's the midline. A high point is a point, literally a dot, on the upper half of a line of text. That means stop. Take a breath and go on. Okay? Take a breath. Why? Because you're going to start delivering another part of an oration. Okay? Full stop or period. Point on the line, semicolon, refers to here. It's not, so take that one off. It's not that. Okay? Is what? It's a shorter form of the full stop. That is, it's not as long a pause as after the full stop. And in the comma, the middle point, down here, is an even shorter break. In other words, what does the comma, and this is how the idea of the comma splice ultimately comes about. What does the comma not indicate according to oratorical delivery? Yeah, you haven't ended an idea. You've merely paused to take a breath and go on. The full stop means the idea is complete. Now I'm giving you a new idea, okay? But nobody talked about comma splices until it's got to be the earliest 1800. So that point system gets adopted by Latin grammarians. We jump up 1,000 years or so. Aldus Manutius, Renaissance printer, adapts punctuation of Greek paragraphs, including paragraph. If you were to read a manuscript of, I don't know, classical Roman, classical Greek, Anglo-Saxon even, so the Beowulf poem, in Old English, it's not divided up into lines. It reads left margin to right margin, left margin, right all the way over, with no breaks really. I mean, it's got some points every now and then, but it just all reads together. Now, ancient Greek and Roman, you don't even get a break, a separation in words. That is, there's not a space between words. So it's just like all written together. Okay? So one of the things that the grammarians do by indicating those pauses is they start to break it up. Okay? Manutius then starts breaking it up even more. In the Beowulf manuscript, as an example, there are breaks between words, but sometimes there's breaks within words. Like the word belief, for example. In some instances, in Beowulf, you can have a word like belief, and you have B-E, a space, L-I-E-F. It doesn't mean that the scribe wants you to say be-leaf. Not sure what it means. One scholar, a guy named Bob Stevick, thinks that the way the manuscript is written, it's written like a musical score. It's telling us how the poem is to be chanted, to be recited, sung. Okay? Manutius then introduces apostrophe, semicolons, question mark, etc., etc. Okay? So you have a little brief, very brief, kind of tree format of the development of writing. North Semitic syllabary. Notice, obviously, what this does not include. It doesn't include any of the Asian writing systems. Asian meaning, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, etc. It doesn't include any of the Indian scripts. Okay? Why? No influence on Western. This is all just focusing on Western, though I do have, this included here. The Indian scripts do come possibly from Aramaic. West, Phoenician, Greek, etc., etc. You've got a little bibliography if you are interested. If you want to do paper on writing, most of this focuses on the Middle Ages and later. Most of these are pretty old. This is I think this is the one that I got the comment that I referred to earlier from. Reading the past, ancient writing from cuneiform to the alphabet. I've got a book in my office. It's this one. I'm pretty sure the library has this. Big, massive, thick book. But if you're get interested in writing in a nerd, that might be useful. Okay, any questions about all of that? I don't spend a lot of time on the history of writing, even though we just spent, 45 minutes, 55 minutes plus earlier, simply because it's not the central focus of this class, but from everything we do on now is when we really start in history of English per se, okay? So, Unit 3, Indo-European Beginnings of English. This is, I think, correlates to about Chapter 3 in your textbook. So you got different kinds of language classification. And I'm going to go over this real briefly because I want to start us into Indo-European. So, typological classification, that is, classifying language according to its type, its kind, if you want. What kind of language is this? And you have 4 that are discussed in your textbook. 4 main ones. There are others, but 4 main ones. Isolating. Okay? One idea expressed in one word. Example, or usually 1 syllable. Example is Chinese. Okay? Agglutinative. Words constructed of several parts, each part containing significant grammatical meaning. Example, Turkish. And I always forget to do this. And I always tell myself I need to remember bringing that note card. When I was teaching this course, when I was a graduate student, and I was asked by the chair at the department I was in to teach this on the Gulf Coast satellite campus of the University of Southern Mississippi. I had a guy in the class who was former military, and he had served in Turkey for a while. Okay? And he was like, oh, I got a great example for this. And he wrote down on a note card for me 1 word. Okay? Notice, words constructed of several parts, each part containing significant grammatical meaning. He wrote down essentially 1 word. And the word meant almost everything in the sentence. It was one big long word, had about, 20, 25 letters. And it was something like, I am a male American. And I was like, whoa. And I've got it in my office, and I just never remembered to bring it. Incorporative. Single word carries major sentence elements. That is, noun, verb, object, etc. Eskimo is an example. Okay? This is what's important for us. Inflective or fusional, what are called fusions. Inflections or fusions carry the significant grammatical meanings. Boy, boys. Okay, the z ending is indicating either plurality or possessive. Okay? The Indo-European languages are inflective. or fusional if you want. I'm going to use inflection. I don't like the word fusional. So, there's another kind of classification that is not typological, genetic. What do? You look at a language and you try and trace it back. You try and trace it back to its earliest form. Classifying languages according to sound and structure correspondence, which indicate derivation from a common source. For example, English and Germanic. English and modern German. Both derive from a common source called Proto-Germanic. Okay? English and Latin, or English and French. Both ultimately derive from a common source. We call that Proto-Indo-European, which we'll talk about. Right? So, Indo-European. Notice, it's got two components to it. It wasn't always called Indo-European. At some points, it was called Indo-Aryan. Any idea what scholars from what group tend to call it Indo-Aryan? Yeah, Germanic scholars. Okay. But Indo-European. So, Indo, representing what area on the map? This area, Indian, European, and this area. So it's this northwest. It's not over here, what are called the Altaic languages. It's not down here, Semitic languages. It's not here, the African languages. That is, the Semitic languages, Hebrew, are not Indo-European. They derive from probably a sister language, or brother if you want, to Indo-European. Okay? But, and this doesn't show up all because it's not color like it is in your notes. If you print your notes out in color, they should come out in color. Pretty much Indo-European languages are spoken around the world today. What's the number one? English. It's become the world language. Okay? For good or for ill, it's become the world language. So where does the phrase Indo-European come from? 9 o'clock, we got 25 minutes. Sir William Jones, British judge, serving in India in the 18th century. Okay? Who was a language guy. I mean, he loved languages. He loved studying languages. And because he was serving in India, he learned Sanskrit. Okay? Now, Sanskrit is not the modern language spoken in India. It wasn't in 1786 either. Sanskrit is essentially, I'm going to walk this back in just a moment, but it's essentially a dead language. Here's how it's not a dead language. If you are Hindu, Sanskrit may not be dead to you. It might be dead in that you don't use it every day, but it's living in that it is a living religious language. Okay? Similar to, as an example, Old Church Slavonic, which we'll talk about in a moment. Old Church Slavonic is a dead form of the Slavic languages, unless you are Russian Orthodox and you go to a Russian Orthodox church that still uses Old Church Slavonic in their services, because many of them do. They don't use modern Russian. They use the form of Russian that was spoken literally 1,000 years ago, 988, when Prince Vladimir accepted Orthodox Christianity as the new religion for Russia. Okay? So, Jones learned Sanskrit. Why? He wanted to better understand the Indian culture. Sanskrit's the language of the Bhagavad Gita, for example, okay? Or the Mahabharata. So, he learned Sanskrit. He already knew Greek and Latin. Why? Because he was well educated. He knew German. He knew French. So, he started learning this other language, and he said this: the Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, that is, however old it is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, okay? More copious than the Latin, that is, it is a richer, fuller language than Latin, okay? And more exquisitely refined than either. What does he mean, more exquisitely refined? Probably he means it has more, for example, noun cases, more active noun cases. 8 cases. That is, 8 parts of speech for nouns. Subject, verb, object, nominative, dative, accusative, genitive, and then 4 more. Okay? More exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, that is closeness, similarity, both in the roots of verbs and in the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. So, Sanskrit, he says, has similarities to Latin and Greek in what? In the roots of verbs. Notice, not the endings. Endings change easily. Roots don't. Right? And in the forms of grammar, that could have been by accident. It's not an accident that these things all have verb roots that are very, very similar. So strong indeed, no philologer, that is a person who works with language like I'm doing right now, could examine them all 3 without believing them to have sprung from some common source. Sanskrit, Latin, and Greek have a single parent, or grandparent, or great-grandparent, as the case may be. Okay? Which perhaps no longer exists. There is a similar reason, though not quite so forceful, for supposing that both the Gothic, Germanic, and the Celtic, though blended with a very different idiom, had the same origin with the Sanskrit. And the Old Persian might be added to the same family, if we were going to talk about Persian. So what does he just link? What country is Persia? Iran. So the Old Persian, Iranian, and its subforms. Okay. Sanskrit and its subforms. The Prakrits, which then developed into modern day Hindi, Bengali, etc. Okay. All the Germanic languages, all the Romance languages, all the Greek languages, all the Celtic languages. He has just said, probably derived from a common source. Nobody thought that prior to him. What did most quote-unquote scholars think was the parent language of humanity? Whatever was spoken in the Garden of Eden. What was spoken in the Garden of Eden? Believe it or not, many said Hebrew. What's the problem with that logic? What happened subsequent to the Garden of Eden? Yeah, it's this little place called Tower of Babel. You know, Nimrod tried to build a tower, reach up to the heavens, and God said, not good. So I'm going to scatter their tongues. So, according to that biblical story, the language of Eden, gone. Okay? If one wanted to argue that. So, German, we're going to go from there to German Indo-European linguists, philologists. You can click on this link and you can read more about it than you ever want, unless you get to be really, really nerdy, in which case, good. So, Jacob Grimm. You're all familiar with this guy. Grimm's Fairy Tales. One of the 2 brothers. Not like the stupid movies with, you know, what's his name who killed himself and the other guy whose name I can't remember. Heath Ledger and can't remember the other. Jacob Grimm emphasized phonology, the sounds of language, in his book Deutsche Grammatik, okay? Or Teutonic grammar. I know Teutonic's a pretty old word. German grammar, that he published, 2nd edition, 1822. The 2nd edition is the really important one. Why? Because he rips off some ideas from a guy who's going to show up on the next page. A Danish philologist named Rasmus Rask, who's right here. Right there. Rasmus Rask's influence on Grimm, particularly Grimm's Law. He's a Danish philologist, as I said. Then there's another German named Franz Bopp. He emphasizes morphology. Now again, what's the difference between phonology and morphology? Phonology is the study of phones, right? Sounds. Morphology, the study of morphemes, smallest meaningful units of a language. Okay? That's what Bopp emphasizes. And he writes as Vergleichende Grammatik, or comparative grammar. Now, Grimm's Deutsch Grammatik is also comparative, but he's comparing Germanic languages. Right? Bopp writes his comparative grammar. He looks at Germanic, Latin, Greek, Celtic, and he's looking at what? Words, essentially. Okay? So the term Indo-European comes about. Also called Indo-Germanic, also called Aryan. Okay? What does Aryan mean? It doesn't mean Nazi supremacy and all that nonsense. Ultimately, according to many scholars, and I think according to Calvert-Watkins' Dictionary of Indo-European Roots, its root means us. Us. We have nations today that are named after this word. Aryan sounds like a nation that was just mentioned. Iran. Okay? There's another one on the western outpost of Europe. Ireland. Ireland. Okay? So, why would we call ourselves, we being, the Aryans, us? What's that implying? Not them. Okay? It's a marker. It's those who are like me, rather than those who are like them. So people who want to say, the United States today is more xenophobic than it's ever been. Okay, maybe so. But guess what? That xenophobia idea, that's Indo-European. That goes back about 6,000, 7,000 years. It's our people as opposed to those people. Okay? So, also called Indo-Germanic. Why? It used to be thought that the Indo-European homeland was possibly in modern-day Germany, between these two rivers, the Vistula and the Elbe. We'll talk about that in a moment. The term Indo-European was coined by Thomas Young. We've heard his name before, in 1813. He was the one who first started cracking the hieroglyphic code that Champollion then, based upon Young's work, finally deciphered the Rosetta Stone. Okay? Now, if you're going to talk about Indo-European, you've got to talk about who these people were, where they came from. So let's go. Let's see. Is that in or out? Yeah, let's zoom out a little bit. See how much of these maps I can get. So Paul Thiebe, early 20th century, pretty sure 20th century, Indo-Europeanist, suggested North Central Europe between the Vistula and Elbe rivers. That's an ear. Nobody accepts that today. Nobody. There's just too good, hard evidence that suggests it can't be from there. Okay? So that's an early one. Where else? Okay? 3 major theories. Maria Gimbutas, Colin Renfrew, and Thomas Gamkrelidze, and V.V. Ivanoff. Okay? Colin Renfrew, British. Maria Gimbutas, Finnish, actually. Finland, Finnish. Okay? And Gamkrelidze and Ivanoff, Russians. Okay? So, three major ideas. Gimbutas, beginning in the 1950s, she is an archaeologist and a linguistic archaeologist. She's an anthropologist, essentially. Does a bunch of digs in southern Russia, the southern steppes of Russia, and she proposes the area northwest of the Caucasus and north of the Caspian Sea. Okay? Caucasus Mountains are right here between the Caspian and Black Seas. Okay? Black Sea, Caspian Sea. This area is where she proposes as Indo-European homeland. She links the Indo-Europeans to what's called the Kurgan culture. A kurgan is simply a burial mound. Okay? And she does so on the basis of archaeological finds and linguistic anthropology. That is comparing myths of various Indo-European peoples that seem to have a tie, if you like, or a connection to the archaeology of this area. For example, there are myths that deal an awful lot with cattle raids, with chariots, with wheels and such. This is the area where the wheel first is made, where the wheel first develops, where the first cart is made, for example. Okay? She identifies Indo-European peoples, as I said, with the Kurgan culture of roughly 5000 BC. It's the best explanation for Indo-European ideology. Well, we don't have time to go into Indo-European ideology. That class I took, Foundations of Indo-European Thought and Culture, that was essentially an entire semester on Indo-European ideology. I can say briefly a couple of things that it includes. It includes, or has, what's called a tripartite structure. Almost every Indo-European country in the world today still has this tripartite structure. That is, it's divided into three parts. What was the genius of the American founders? The Constitution. The Constitution is divided into what? Three parts. What are the three parts of government? Executive, legislative, judicial. These have their corollaries in Indo-European thought. The Indo-European structure was king, chieftain, priest, religious class. What do you think's the third? It's either I can say that. Everyone else, okay? And included somewhere in these two, usually more in this, is, for lack of a better word, the military, okay? Well, this is like us, right? King, chieftain, that's the executive. What is our priestly religious class in terms of the government? It's our judges. Everyone else? The House of Representatives. They speak for us. The Supreme Court, they do not speak for us. What do they speak? They interpret the law like it's handed down from Mount Sinai. Where's the law come from? Us, okay? But it didn't come from us in Indo-European times. It was the priest who spoke to, listened to, divined the Dias Pitar, or Sky Father, and it's from this name, sometimes it's spelled U.S., and it's from this person that we get Jupiter. The dais is the same word as Zeus, which is the same word as in Greek, theos, which is the same word you see in the word enthusiasm. What does it mean to be enthused? The theos is God. Enthused is to have the God breathed into you. So when you're enthusiastic, what does it mean? You're full of God. You're so excited. It's like the verb, or the noun inspiration. If you're inspired, you breathe in. Okay? So, her theory is the best one for Indo-European ideology. Okay? According to her theory, the migrations of the Proto-Indo-European peoples, who initially start up right here, these migrations began around 4,000 to 3,000 BC. And that's kind of what is being shown roughly right here. Map showing the Kurgan hypothesis, dispersion 4,500 to 2,500 BC. That is, you've got some people starting to move off over this direction. Notice, where you see the darker shade, that's the group starting to spread out. Right? 1,500-year period. Excuse me, 2,000-year period. That's quite a bit of spread. So go down to the next one. This is showing the Kurgan hypothesis dispersion from roughly 2,500 to 1,800 BC. So you've got a branch moving up over here into Northern Europe. You've got a branch moving off over here. This is the Aryan branch, okay? Persian, Iranian, if you want. You got a group moving down here. Okay? You got a western branch moving over here. You got a group down here called the Anatolian group, etc. So, I think there's one more slide for Kurgan hypothesis. This is now 1800, 1200 BC. What happens, we think, historically, or maybe just mythologically, historically, in that period, roughly 1800, 1200 BC, right around here on the coastline. Trojan War. Okay. Homer, who's writing, if Homer really existed, sometime in the 800s BC, Homer is writing about an event that occurred roughly 700, 800 years before him. Okay. He's writing about the Trojan War. Well, that's happening sometime during this. So, notice how they've now spread. This is where they started. This is where they started from. Okay. So you have the Iranians. They're going to move here, and they're going to move through the Hindu Kush Mountains down into Iran. Because what is this area right here? Modern day. This is a rock. Okay. Over here is Iran. Right. Balto-Slavic peoples moving over here. Germanic peoples moving over here. It's not an accident. The Balto-Slavic and the Germanic peoples are really close together. Why? They share some similarities that aren't shared among any of the other Indo-European groups. Okay. Similarly, the Germanic peoples and the Hittite peoples share a similarity none of the other Indo-European groups share, which presents a problem. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay? You got the Italo-Celtic groups. Why? Because Italic languages and Celtic languages seem to be more closely related than do Italic and Germanic languages. So think of some of these is kind of being like brother, sister, and others like half brother, half sister, etc. And you keep kind of going out farther. You take them back far enough that we got two common parents. Okay, but then they start intermarrying and remarrying and all kinds of stuff happens. Okay? So that's Gimbutas's Kurgan theory. Now I should mention, there is one group, I'll talk about this maybe on Thursday. There's one Indo-European language group that we can't really explain very well. It's called Tocharian. The language they spoke is Tocharian. Two forms of it, Tocharian A and B. The language was discovered in the Gobi Desert, which would be way up here, middle of Mongolia. Okay? And the reason it's hard to explain is because Tocharian, one, shouldn't exist there, and two, it's related to languages on the basis of where it occurs, it doesn't look like it should be related to. Okay, we'll stop there since we've got a minute to go. Questions? I haven't given you much time. All right, we'll do more Indo-European on Thursday.